Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Writing for Optimal Global Customer Experience. My name is Becky and I will be moderating this event. Attendees have the opportunity to place questions into the chat during this session. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to your speaker, Alison. Thank you. You may now begin.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The agenda, we're going to talk about why write explicitly for global customer experience and what I mean by that. I'll cover brand guidance, linguistic style guides, how writing style affects your translation costs, and it can significantly. We'll cover terminology. I'll talk about why plagiarism can sometimes be a good thing. And I'll have a load of practical examples and also talk about graphics and images and how text expands in translation. Now, before I get started, I'll tell you a little story. Once upon a time, long ago, in another lifetime, I worked as a technical author for a large multinational company. And my first day on the job, my new manager gave me his talk, the talk he gave to all new hires. He said, "Every technical author here is highly talented and extremely creative, and you've all got a bestseller novel that you're going to write someday. But you're going to write that novel at home. You're not writing it here in the office. Here at work, your job is to communicate. Forget all about being an author, even though it's in your job title. Consider yourself a communicator instead. And that starts with how you communicate directly and clearly in plain English. Now go away and write." And that was my introduction to being a technical author for this large company. And that guidance that came from him all those years ago is really what we're covering today. So how to communicate rather than how to write. Now, just in case you're not familiar with CSA Research, we are a market research company that specializes in global business, in localization, translation management, interpreting, everything around global and languages. We research with buyers, so global enterprises, NGOs, governments, anybody that buys any form of language service or technology. We research LSPs and technology vendors, we research freelancers and the consumers of all this content. So this is where I'm coming from. I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research. So let's get started. Now, why even think about writing for the global customer experience? Well, today we have to consider that all of the content is global, unless it's a private one-to-one conversation where there are expectations and rules for privacy, that is. Whether or not you actually provide translations, anyone can use web-based or app-based MT services to translate content that they don't understand. And they can translate using those tools with varying results. In this webinar, we'll look at how to write content that not only enhances the global customer experience itself, but which will be easier and less expensive to translate and more effective for machine translation too. Some of the information that I'm going to share is coming from CSA Research Reports. You don't have to write down the list of reports that will appear as subtitles on each of the slides. I'll share a list of them later and they'll be listed at the end of the slides. For many of you, what I'm presenting today will already be well known and part of your standard working processes. However, when talking with CSA research clients, large and small, we see companies and organizations that are new to localization or where many more teams are today involved in creating content. It's always good to remind everybody how important it is to think about global, even when you believe you're creating for one location only. So please use the information in these slides, not only as a refresher for yourselves, but as a starting point for discussion with other teams. More and more today, we're seeing not only trained content creators and writers, like tech authors creating content, but the content creation is spread throughout the entire enterprise. Now, if you create your source content with the global market in mind and follow the guidelines that I'm going to share today, you'll provide the best possible customer experience with information that's easily understood in all languages, including English, if English is your source language. You should see an improved content return on investment, so better global customer experience, a more efficient translation process, and you can improve your translation costs and the accuracy of machine translation, together with reducing the time needed for translation and review. Assume that all content will be translated. And if you're chunking content, so using a content management system, remember that that content gives the translator much less context than a complete document. So if you consider each chunk as an individual piece of information and make sure that that is meaningful and easy to understand as a separate chunk, that is really going to help your translators, and it's really going to help reduce the amount of time that's needed for translation. Remember that your content is going to be read by people of various levels of literacy, various levels of proficiency in English. It may be their second language. They may be using machine translation tools. By creating your content, understanding that it's going to go global, it will really help to simplify your entire process and allow people to understand it much more easily. So some of the tools that you have to hand include brand guidance, style guides, and there are typically two types of style guides used in enterprises and organizations. There's the corporate level brand guide that defines your visual style, your corporate persona, and then separately linguistic style guides that help translators and reviewers and others to convey that global brand in languages other than the headquarters languages. Now, both of those types of guidance are important, and they're real tools to help your organization. Your corporate brand may be defined in several places. Not only in the official brand style guide, which may be very, very detailed down to the exact font point sizes and the precise shade of purple that you can use, but then also consider any company writing guide or authoring manual, training for the codes of business conduct, anything that defines your organization's persona. And then you have glossaries and terminologies of preferred or banned terms. For example, all of your employees may be trained to convey honesty, confidence, youthfulness, honesty, ethical business dealings. And this is how the company portrays itself to the world. The brand may have catchphrases that encapsulate this spirit in a few words. Catchphrases and marketing taglines, such as these that are coming up on the screen right now, can be some of the biggest and most expensive translation challenges when going global. They require more creative handling than, say, a user manual. So these are things that really must be conveyed in the style of the translations, things that have to be taken from the corporate brand guide and the description of the corporate persona and rendered through your linguistic style guides and guidance to the linguists so that they can then convey them in each of the target languages. Some of this content that's around the brand may need multilingual copywriting or even rewriting of content in the target language because it just doesn't translate with the same impact, or because there are cultural differences in your target markets. Perhaps the most obvious way that writing style affects translation is in marketing content, especially highly personal content and taglines that aim to encourage an emotional reaction in the reader. This type of content usually needs to be transcreated or even to be rewritten, copywritten from scratch in the target language to make certain that your messaging has the desired results in the target market. Now, this is the area of content where mistakes are highly visible and can be detrimental to the brand. So if your source content and your source style is simple and clear in English, and I'm talking a lot about English because I'm assuming that most of you have English as your source language. If that English marketing content is clear or very well defined in your linguistic style guides, that will make it easier and faster for your translators to translate and render into the target languages. Now, while it's pretty obvious that carefully crafted marketing messaging requires special attention to deliver the desired results in translation, what is not always so obvious is how the way that all types of content is written can have a major effect on translation costs. And even more importantly, it can have effect on your brand's global customer experience. It's becoming even more important with the rapid spread of MT and the use of AI and machine learning to take this in hand and make sure that you're writing in a way that's easy to translate. And it's not just writing style, it's also the layout. You can have, simple or difficult or even impossible translations, depending on how the content is written. Small differences or inconsistencies can prevent translation being reused and instead cause content with identical meaning to be translated and paid for over and over and over again. And I'm going to give you some examples of that later. And the design of the English layout, or the source layout, often means much more work after the actual translation has been done. So that's often classified as things like formatting or testing or desktop publishing, DTP, which all add costs to your localization bill. So it's really easy to make translation difficult and expensive. These are just some examples. You know, if you include spelling and punctuation and spacing errors and forget about grammar rules and use slang and your own invented acronyms and confuse those words that we all mix up, and then use really long and convoluted sentences without any punctuation and nowhere to take a breath, and there's nowhere to understand the structure or flow of thoughts and meaning, and you mix up more than one concept in each sentence, and why don't we have a tea break now? Sentences like that are really difficult to translate. They're impossible for machine translations to convert to another language successfully, and they cost more to work on. So your company may already have a good style guide to help authors avoid these mistakes. But what we found when talking to larger enterprises and to the buyers of language services that CSA talks to is that often, yes, those guides exist, but over time, people forget that they're there and they forget to use them. So if you already have these good writing style guides, find them, review them, and make sure that your teams and your linguists know to use them as reference material. Now, if there's one thing that you take away from this webinar today, it's this checklist. All of these guides, these best practices make it easy to have accurate, on-brand translations with a consistent and meaningful global customer experience. The money and time you save by writing in a way that's easy to translate may allow you to translate more. And so, this slide is the one of everything in this presentation that I want you to take away. And there's one more bullet. Use the active voice. So take this slide with you. Terminology. An essential part of content creation and translation is terminology. If you don't get the terminology right, at best, your global customer experience and brand will be disjointed and inconsistent. At worst, your products might not sell, or customers will return goods thinking that they are not what they purchased. And I have seen that happen, where a marketing description included functions that were translated and described in one way, and the packaging for the product and the user documentation was translated to describe it in a very different way. Customers returned the products because they did not believe they had received what they'd ordered. So it can be an expensive thing when you get terminology wrong. Terminology is king. I'm using the word king as an example of a term. The king concept is of a ruler, someone who's in charge, someone whose word is law. The word or phrase that encompasses that concept, that idea, might not be a direct literal translation in each language. And even if there is a literal translation for a term, it might not be appropriate for a target market's culture. In our king example, you probably wouldn't have used terminology is Tsar during the Russian Revolution. It just wouldn't have made good marketing copy. So terms which are ambiguous or which have a specific meaning in the context of your company's services or brand must be defined and shared with not only your translators, but also anybody who's writing content. So people who are writing user manuals or creating marketing content, but also those who are posting on social media, the developers for your UI and software and products. Anybody today who is creating content in any form needs this type of guidance. Your translation technology team also needs access to that terminology, for example, for machine translation training or for whatever they may be developing with AI and machine learning. Terminology is essential. So these are some examples of content which would be defined as terminology or which might require transcreation. And you can start going through your content and identifying different types of content that needs different actions. And we've taken these examples from the CSA Research website. You'll have your own. I mean, one thing that you can do when thinking about writing content for a global audience is to do a content audit, for example, where you will be looking at the types of content, what content needs translation, what should not be translated, what needs to be defined as terminology, and what types of content within your organization really requires transcreation or local copywriting today. Now, in this example, I've got some things like can't read, won't buy, which is the title of a report. In our context, we may decide that should not be translated. So in our terminology definition, we say do not translate. Words like member or panel or advisory that have specific meanings within the context of our business need to be defined as terms. And then we've got some sentences like this one, the power of reliable data-based analysis, which probably needs to be transcreated to have the same appeal in the target languages. I use those examples of member, panel, and advisory, because these are all words that have multiple possible translations, but are used as a concept with a specific meaning for CSA research. Now, you can store transcreated taglines and other messaging as part of your terminology. So you have a terminology management system and it's integrated within your translation workflow. Putting your marketing taglines in as terminology can be a really good way to make sure that feeling that translation is consistent across all of your company's content. That means that you have to bring in your marketing folks together with the localization team to work together to gather those elements as early as possible in the process so that they're shared throughout the entire global content process. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of what happens when ambiguous terms are not defined clearly and risk being multiplied by translation. Now, the word plan, if you think about it in English, it already has several meanings. In the context of healthcare and insurance, for example, it has a very specific definition. Yet, if that's not explained, there are many opportunities for choosing the wrong meaning for the word plan and then translating it. Imagine a translator who receives just a small chunk of content creating the term, containing the term, but with no other information to guide them. They have to either guess the meaning and use the one that they believe is the right fit, or they spend time researching it or calling you up to ask questions, which holds back the timeline of the translation project. And this is why terms need to be defined and shared with the linguists up front. Before they're used and before anyone even thinks about translating them, you want to have them defined. And this example, plan, could be a noun or a verb. And then if you think about, so this word plan has only a few meanings in English. There are other words that have many more. But then consider how that becomes multiplied if you've got many different languages, because the same thing happens in other languages. They can have multiple uses for the same word or term. And then on top of that, each linguist is a different individual human being who also has their own opinions. So it can be incredibly messy if there's no standard definition for a term that is a key part of your business and brand. So here's the same term, plan, with the addition of two languages. Just see how it gets more complicated. Different linguists might choose those different, accurate, but inconsistent translations. And it has a inconsistent impact on your whole global brand and the customer experience. Here's another example, the word touch, and I've seen this in use in a specific large enterprise's website. There are multiple meanings for that word in English and multiple translations in every language into which we translate. So it's really important to capture this terminology before the translation begins and define it. Sorry, I'm repeating that, but it's just really important. Also remember that many linguists often work for multiple companies within the same vertical market, especially when it's a freelance linguist at the end of the supply chain. They work with different clients who have different preferred translations. And if we're not presenting them with the terminology guidance at the point at which they're doing the work, they have to try to remember your preferences and to juggle it. And it's always much better to make sure that they have that information when they need it. Also, Any change in an LSP or their pool of linguists or your own in-house translators, they also risk having another new opinion added into the mix. So make sure that the terminology is defined. Make sure that you're very clear about what must not be translated, and then make sure that your TMS or workflow system makes it really easy for linguists to know and use the correct terms while they're working on your content. You don't want to have to go and look it up in a dictionary or a term guide. Make sure it's right there in front of them when they're typing in their translation. So here's an example of how to define a term or concept. Terminology is not just a list of terms, words, or phrases and their translations. It's guidance for your linguists. And again, I've taken the word plan as an example, and it's used within a US healthcare context. In this example, it's an offering of a service that a member can subscribe to. There may be multiple types of plan available and many contexts in which this noun is used. Defining it clearly with examples in the source English language is the baseline for consistent content in the English content. And then the corresponding information for each target language needs to be added, or an instruction not to translate if it always remains in English. And that's a typical situation with some product names, for example, when you don't translate them. Now, there are standards around terminology. There's TBX, which is formalized as an ISO standard. It's available as an open source document, but the full TBX structure is very detailed and requests a lot of data that many users don't find useful. It's rather an academic standard. There's another one which is called TBX Basic, which is much more business-friendly version. And really, just go back to the previous slide, these are the key parts. So then the term itself, a definition of the grammatical structure of that term, a definition of how it's used in your company, and some examples are the really important things to define when you're defining terminology. Don't be overwhelmed by the standards. Keep it simple, but use that basic guidance for your terms. Plagiarism can be a good thing sometimes. And let's take a look at content reuse and what that means. Each person has a different way of expressing themselves. And just because somebody else wrote it doesn't mean that it's incorrect and that you have to change it. These are the types of guidelines to provide to reviewers of translations, for example, and to creators of content where they're able to reuse content from other situations. They should not change the content or the translation just because they would have written it slightly differently. Those are what we call preferential changes. Instead, instruct them to make corrections for errors only. For example, if there's an incorrect use of terminology or a misunderstanding of the source text in translation. Just because somebody is tasked with checking the content does not mean that they must change something. And this is really important when you're paying a third party to check another linguist or supplier's translation. They don't have to change something just to prove they're doing a good job. Now, some examples of valid reuse of content in your source content might be from one product description or technical specification to another. They don't have to be completely different, but it still needs to be different enough when the content is used to differentiate products or features. One thing that we saw with the early proliferation of content management systems and the idea that you reuse content was that it can be very easy for multiple products with a similar feature set to reuse content and then end up looking exactly the same. You have to be careful and to consider that, but reuse your content when you can. Don't change it. It will It will allow you to have better reuse from your translation memory. Your translations will cost less and your user experience will be more consistent again. Now, I'm going to take you through some of these guidelines in action with some practical examples. All of these are in our reports. There's many more examples in the report with the same title as this webinar, and I'll give you the list of those reports at the end. These are a few practical examples. Some of them will be very appropriate for your own organization or company. Some might be less so because you're doing things differently. So use it as a reference. And a word of warning, once you start to look at content in this way, you start analyzing it, it will become a habit. You'll start seeing ambiguity in everything. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to see that ambiguity. It's a good thing, because then you'll be able to better make informed choices about your content and know where to provide guidance to linguists and reviewers. So let's see some of the examples. Step-by-step instructions remove any doubt about the order in which to do things. So check the power and the switch settings can be ambiguous because you're not sure what you're doing when. Now, a better example would be check that the power is on and then check the switch settings. But even better is to put that into a bulleted list. Step 1, check that the power is on. It's clear, it's definite. You know what you need to do then. And then step 2, after you've done that, is to check the switch settings. This makes it easier to read. It makes it easier to understand. It increases your translation accuracy because there's no ambiguity in each of those sentences. It's then more effective in machine translation because there is no ambiguity. It should be really easy for MT to get correct. And that means it's all lower cost because it could be MT, it could be faster translation. Nobody's having to come back and ask questions. There's no need for extra reviews or getting things wrong and having to go back and do things over and over again. And these reasons for making changes to your writing style apply to the majority of the examples to come. So making it easier to read and understand, increasing your translation accuracy, leading to lower cost and faster translations. Short sentences. Short sentences have advantages in that they help to reduce the cost by not having to translate unnecessary words. They have a better chance of being found in translation memory. They can improve the translation reuse rate and decrease translation costs further. Sentences that are reused don't have to be translated manually again, so it may reduce the time needed to translate. And it's easier for people who are reading the source content, the English content. It makes it easier for them to understand, especially if they're reading in a second language or they want to read it quickly. It's easier to comprehend. Some people like to skim text very quickly, and that helps them even if they're absolutely fluent in the source language. Use fewer words and use them consistently, and this goes back to terminology as well. But be precise and not verbose. Now, if you take writing English to a very extreme level and have very controlled English, you may have a limited vocabulary that you can use. And these are the sort of things that controlled English uses. So you would have one term like this example, tolerate, which would mean exactly one thing. But in general, it's a good idea to use fewer words and use them consistently. Because again, if you're using machine translation, it's more likely to be correct, and it helps your human linguists because it has just one meaning. Refer to that Wikipedia article that's listed on the screen for an explanation, a really good explanation of phrasal verbs. Another guideline: use just one thought or concept or action per sentence. So this example, the not so good example at the top of the screen, has everything crammed into just one sentence. A much better way to write that would be as numbered bullets that define what happens and when. So it's one thing at a time, steps 1, 2, and 3. Again, easier to understand, easier to translate, and very clear sentences. Use the active voice, be direct. And this is something that, as a technical author in my long distant past, I was told to do. But we still see this over and over again. The enter key should be pressed, or you should see this, or you should do that, or you could do that, or this may happen. Instead, be extremely direct, tell people exactly what they must do or what will happen. Again, easier to understand, easier to translate, easier for everybody. And I am repeating myself a lot, but that's the reason for doing this. And there are more examples in the writing for Global Customer Experience Report. Here's another one, which is more to do with the technology that you use in translation memory. It's really important to be consistent with punctuation and to understand how your translation memory management tools segment sentences. For example, an inconsistent use of colons or semicolons or commas and M or N dashes can reduce the amount of translation memory reuse because your TM system treats them in different ways. Again, this goes back to your writing style guide. Make sure that all content creators know the appropriate punctuation to use and where to use it. Now, different education systems, changing times, different writing styles means that there may be many different applications depending on the writer. So by setting your company's standard for punctuation means that you're going to have a more consistent content experience and improved translation memory reuse. Consistency is key. Some of the obvious things: avoid slang, idiom, and jargon. Use descriptive names. Now, the first one in our example here, donut hole, is something that's well known in US healthcare, but an actual true meaning for it is a coverage gap. Either choose not to use it or to really define that term. The second example is from high tech with dog fooding. It really means using or testing our own product. And I'm sure you can find some other really stellar examples from your own industry. But really better to avoid using slang, using these this idiom and jargon. It's not easy to translate, not always meaningful, and not even always understood by readers in the source language. And don't be funny. We all like to be funny and sporty, but they don't translate well. Many sporting concepts don't translate to other cultures. I mean, baseball There may be the US-based World Championships, but it's really mostly played in the USA and Japan and the Caribbean, perhaps. Home runs may only work for those audiences. Now, in other parts of the world, cricket is a big deal, but that wouldn't work in the US. Sports can be confused in translation too. Football in Europe is soccer in the USA, for example, and sporting personalities who are celebrated and well known in one country are probably unknown in another. So if, for example, you have a marketing campaign and it's really important that local celebrities are part of it, just remember that when it comes to going global, that is content that will need to be adjusted for each and every market where the same campaign is being used. Now, humor can become totally nonsense in translation. It can be difficult or even impossible to translate. It requires local copywriting and transcreation, and it may even be offensive or culturally unacceptable. So again, something to be aware of. And just going back to consistent and correct terminology, it's not only those specific terms and phrases related to your brand that need to be defined, it's choosing one word, one term for words that mean the same thing. And this may be defined in your writing style guide. There are also tools that can help content creators to check that they're using consistent terms. So this type of thing is the sort of term to look out for and to guide content creators or editors in using them right in the source content. Choose one term and use it consistently across the company. Check terminology and style guides. Make sure that you're using the correct one, and make sure any new terms that turn up are updated in your terminology. Now, that may be that means talking to your LSPs, asking them to propose terms when they see something that's coming up that's not being defined, making sure that you've got that communication loop in place so that you can gather terms that arise over time. We've talked with many enterprises that do this differently. Some have a named reviewer per country or per language. Others ask one LSP to take responsibility of managing their terminology for translation. And still others have a terminology governance council internally and internal voting on how to apply and translate new terms as they come up. It's also really good to have developers and designers involved in terminology from the very beginning, because they're often the ones who come up with new terms for the user interface that then needs to permeate throughout all of the company's content. Okay, the example here shows that support is for customers, and the customers may own either or both widgets or gizmos. Now, this is an example where you might need a little longer sentence to make things really clear. So don't expect all content that you're writing for a global audience to automatically be shorter. Sometimes you do need those extra words to make it really, really clear. Now, in this example, your human translator may work it out and know how to translate it. Your machine translation will not, and they will confuse it. The second example would be easier for empty. It's got a clear grammatical structure. Avoid over-modifying nouns. Now, I'm not really certain that the so-called good example on this slide means exactly the same thing as the not so good example. And this shows how difficult over-modified nouns can be to understand in English. And imagine the translator's job, or that of someone for whom English is a second language, when they try to understand it. It's got to be really clear. Use hyphens to increase understanding. Now, Microsoft Word's grammar checker will tell you to lose the hyphens. It will tell you to use to remove that hyphen in that second example. However, that example under good on this slide clearly shows that the benefits are underused. The not so good example could indicate that something is below, underneath the used benefits. So correct hyphenation is more important than scoring 0 on Microsoft Word's grammar check. The Oxford comma, the comma that appears after the last but one word in a list and before the and, it's a subject of much discussion. Now, where I grew up and where I went to school in the UK, we never used the Oxford comma. In the US, it's taught and you do use the Oxford comma. Now, when it comes to writing for translation, the Oxford comma before the and really helps with clarity and accuracy, so use it. Bulleted lists. Bulleted lists can really help with the clarity, understanding, ease of translation. The important thing to remember is that each bullet should be consistent and able to form a full sentence with the preceding clause. And to remember that the translator may see each bullet independently and out of context. Now, they're shorter and easier to understand and translate than a long convoluted sentence, but if your CMS chunks things up, remember that you should provide plenty of context to go with it. Be wary of certain symbols and icons. They don't always convey the same meaning in target languages. Light bulb, thumbs up, the usual things. Some things might be offensive, but even text symbols have different meanings in different languages. For example, the pound sign, is it a hash sign or is it a British pound sign? Ampersands can mean different things. And something that I learned quite recently, even after many, many years in this business, is that a check mark or a tick actually has the opposite meaning in English versus Japanese and some other languages. So these are things to be aware of. Now let's look at graphics a little closer too. Images and layouts are an important part of content design, and they also affect the translation process, the timeline, and your budget. Again, there are many more examples in our report, Writing to Optimize Your Global Customer Experience, and there'll be a link at the end of this, but here's a few. Pseudo translations used to be a programmatic example of how language changes and expands in translation, and some companies are still using that. But today, machine translation can achieve the same thing, which will include characters from your target languages and allows you to do a really good test of what will happen to the layout of your document once it's translated. Machine translation doesn't have to be accurate to be useful for testing layout, so it's something that's a really useful tool. But best practices when it comes to layout in content that's where it's important that the layout is considered. Use or leave a lot of extra white space to allow for expansion. Use text expansion guidelines, and I'll give you some in a moment, to reduce risk. Refer to the graphics section in this report, Content Source Optimization, a checklist to help. And then again, use MT to test the layout before you go to a full translation. Now, here's some examples of what might happen to English when it's translated into Spanish or Ukrainian. And I do not speak either of those languages well, so if there's a mistake there, I apologize. Translated versions may end up squashed or enlarged due to text expansion, depending on how your publishing software works. If you have to have text in images, make sure that you have talked with your LSP about how to handle those, what sort of source documents they need to, or source files they need to work with, and how to allow for that text to expand. And then understand what happens to the entire document or page layout if an image that contains text expands. And your translators absolutely must receive the source image file. Now, here's some examples of how much text will expand when it's translated. Now, this is very generic. It differs by language and by content style, but it's to give you a rough idea. The fewer the number of characters in the English content, the source content, the more likely it is that it will expand an awful lot in translation. In general, text can require an average of 30 to 40 more real estate than in English, but even more space is needed when the amount of text is small. So, for example, in labels, headings, or titles, those are typical areas where you'll see layout and format broken because the German or the Finnish has got so long, doubled or even tripled the English. Now, Asian text may have fewer characters to express the same meaning, but might require a larger or more vertical font to allow those characters to be legible. So that affects it in a different way. Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I've been talking about today, and then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. So by considering how you write your content in the first place, you can improve your customer experience. You can have content that is easier to understand in all languages, including English. It can be easier to understand for readers for whom English is a second language and for anyone with reading difficulties, but also have that knock-on effect for all of your target languages when you're translating. And to reduce translation costs, make it faster, make it easier, making even machine translation more accurate. And this matters because it affects your customer satisfaction. It means fewer misunderstandings. It means lower translation costs and fewer translation errors, and it can mean shorter localization and testing time. And these are the reports that I mentioned earlier. So writing to optimize your global customer experience is the partner report to this webinar. It has many more examples. We also have a report about content audits and how to carry out the analysis of your content and to find opportunities for improving the content, making your translation workflows easier and more effective. And then other reports that go with this webinar and improving your whole global customer experience. And that's the end of this presentation.
Thanks, Alison. We have a few minutes remaining, so we'll open it up for questions to see if anyone has any. Let's just give a few seconds for people to think. We haven't had any come in now. A lot of times after the event, people will send them in. So I'll forward them along to Allison if anyone does think of anything. And we thank everyone for joining today, Allison for presenting. Join us next week on November 3rd for our next LinkedIn Live event on global multilingual websites. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.